We are here to talk about Africa's tech rush. So let me start with why should investors look at Africa as an investment opportunity as opposed to Silicon Valley, China, or India?
I mean, everyone else is doing it. Why wouldn't you? Look at the past decade, and then look at the next 50 years. The graph I just showed you before of looking at population, just demographics.
We actually have a graphic showing smartphone connections and projections.
Over the next 80 years, most of the population growth in the world is taking place in Africa.
But it's not even just 80 years, right? In the next 3 years, 50% of the GDP growth will be coming out of emerging markets, and second only to emerging Asia is Africa. I think if you're looking at the opportunities that you saw like in Brazil in the 90s or in the wild, wild west, in the 20s or whatnot, or the 1800s, there's only so many places right now on the planet where there's just so much opportunity for innovation to take hold and for needs to be met, which is ultimately what entrepreneurship is about, right? Meeting the needs of large groups of people. And that, I think, is what's critical in what's going on in Africa. A lot of people will see focusing on these markets as being, being a social entrepreneur. But I've always felt, whether you're giving someone an app that helps them park their car or giving someone water, you're just an entrepreneur, just giving people what they need. And I think the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, that's available to be addressed in Africa just can't be ignored.
And Uncharted Play, your company, saw a need for power.
Yes.
So you developed a soccer ball as well as a jumping rope that gives power, basically. Tell us about how that idea came about.
Sure. So, my story of how I got into energy, I think, is a little more unique. I didn't necessarily see the huge opportunity in energy as much as I had more of a familial connection. I'm a dual citizen of Nigeria and the United States. Most of my family lives in Nigeria. And I, growing up, visited Nigeria at least once a year, and more recently now go several times a year. And regardless of socioeconomic status, regardless of whether or not I'm in the city or the village, we expect to lose power every single day. And, I like to say that innovation lives between a rock and a hard place. And, honestly, after a while, it gets pretty annoying to constantly lose power and wonder when you're going to get power again.
It's not a problem many of us have.
Yeah, and in a weird way, I saw that as something that was a competitive advantage for me, because I was able to see something that was really needed and think about solving it from a global perspective. So first, it started with bridging the gap between what works and what doesn't work in these communities, taking the most popular sport in the world, looking at the pure kinetic energy that's being generated there, and seeing if that can be used as a one-for-one replacement with kerosene lamps, and then expanding to other ubiquitous types of play like jumping rope. And then from there, 6 years later or so, we realized that this core technology could go beyond play. And so we started developing solutions to turn everything that moves into a source of power, from consumer products like strollers to roads and speed bumps and floor panels, et cetera. And so I think what's exciting is that now I'm really thinking about how do we create technologies that match with the unique features of what it means to be African and what it means to grow up in an African city. So you have leaders in African cities that are saying, literally, and I quote, "We don't believe in population control," which means they're just going to keep growing and growing and growing. And you're going to have a huge demand on resources, on infrastructure. So how do we provide solutions that work with that generate more clean, renewable power as people keep driving and keep walking and moving and living in their lives? And how do we think about developing the infrastructure at the same time? And so that's what we do at Uncharted Play now.
And Jeremy Andela focuses on talent and connecting programmers to Silicon Valley companies. You train them up. I hear that the acceptance rate to your program is ultra competitive. Even more competitive than getting into Harvard, where Jessica went to school.
Harvard's a good school too, though.
Yeah. We try. I mean, what can we do?
But how do you find the right talent in Africa, and what do they have to offer these companies in the U.S.? There are plenty of engineers in the U.S. market.
Are there? I mean, by my count, and there's some folks from Stack Overflow here somewhere, you've got 5 open jobs in the U.S. market for software engineers for every developer looking for one. And so, yes, there are a bunch of talented engineers in the U.S. There aren't enough of them. Mm-hmm. And there also aren't really enough in the world. And so Andela's model taking a step back, is to find and invest in the next generation of the world's most talented engineers. You start with a fundamental premise that brilliance and talent has essentially nothing to do with race, gender, nationality. Like, our brains are shockingly similar. And then realize that if you're operating in Silicon Valley and looking for talent, so's everyone else. And if you're willing to take a little bit more of a sort of broad-based approach to how you find great talent around the world, you can find the kind of people who, had they been born in the US, would have ended up at Caltech, MIT, maybe even Harvard. And in India, the IITs, and actually bring those people onto your team. And so Andela supports companies looking to build out these high-end distributed teams by augmenting their existing teams. And in the process, that allows us to invest in the next generation of those people. So going back to the beginning, it's going to sound crazy, but we had, for 4 spots for a pilot class in 2014, we had 700 applicants with virtually no marketing. Like, Twitter was the extent of it. Since, we've had 70,000 applicants, and Andela has grown to about 500 developers across Lagos, Nairobi, and Kampala, and doubling basically every year for the next 3 or 4.
And I think it's important, too, to know, again, it's funny when, because I'm Nigerian, because I have all of my family members there, it's so easy for me to realize, why aren't they hiring these people? They're all here. But I think it's more than just having an access to a larger talent pool. I think it's also understanding the market, right? I think that when you hire people who come from the market, they can then innovate with that market in mind. And they then end up expanding your opportunity to generate revenue and ultimately grow your business. And so that's, I think, what sometimes is missing. When we hire one type of person, we're essentially saying these are the type of people we want to serve. And I think it's overly limiting in that way. When you expand your talent pool, in my mind, and we at Uncharted Play are incredibly diverse for that reason. It's not all just a bunch of black girls who love Beyonce.
But you're headquartered in New York.
Yes, headquartered in New York. Because the concept, again, is we are a global company. And so we need to make sure we have a representative of all the different races and ethnicities and religions and just places to be born. I mean, a majority of the people in my company are under H-1B, for example. We want to understand the world so that we can serve the world better. And it's helped us become, I think, a much more broadly thinking type of company.
Yeah.
We were talking a little bit backstage about the influx of Chinese investment into Africa. Let's talk a little bit about that. How is that impacting your business?
So on our end, so we're essentially a decentralized energy company, masquerading as a play company because it's cuter. People like that. Why not? But when we get into the room, we're essentially saying, allow us to install our products. Basically, allow us to install our products or distribute our products, and we expect, based off of this normal behavior, to be able to generate X amount of megawatts or kilowatts of power, and then people sign power purchase agreements. The reality is that when you're going into infrastructure, when you're going into energy, we also have to look at other competitors who want to get access to the raw materials in Africa, and then as such are looking to invest in infrastructure. It's almost like a trade with the government. And that's essentially where we've seen the Chinese the most. They're coming in hordes to develop manufacturing facilities where they're taking advantage of being that much closer in terms of their supply chain to the raw materials they need for their products. The biggest concerns that we're seeing from a more sustainability perspective is that they're not actually hiring Africans. So
they're bringing in
they're bringing in people from China. And I think from a financial perspective, it's interesting because you can get amazing talent for a very affordable rate in Africa, essentially. A strong average worker's rate would be anywhere from $2 to $5 an hour. If a worker's making $7 an hour, they are probably in the top 10 to 5% of the country. And these are, again, educated individuals. And so there's a question of how do you thwart any type of new colonialism if there's a higher appreciation for what's beneath the feet of the people in this country or on this continent versus the people themselves.
Jeremy, how do you view the influx of Chinese investment into Africa and the impact it's having on your...
I see a lot of discussion around it. It hasn't been overly impactful for us. We have a handful of partners, technology companies across Asia that work with Andela developers. But one of the things that's been interesting over the past few years for us has been realizing that our partners are actually seldom working with us because of the price point. It actually does have much more to do with access to the caliber of talent and the caliber of person that they're able to work with. And so, quite frankly, I was surprised by that as I realized it. But as a result of that's meant that we've had partners all over the world. We've got Andela developers now visiting as part of those partnerships. Literally for typically 2 to 4 week stints at the beginning, going on site at these different companies. And so you've got Nigerian and Kenyan software developers spending a lot more time traveling around the world, staying, living in their home country, but taking visits to get to know the teams that they're working with around the world than there certainly were a few years ago, and that's continuing to scale.
But I do think it's a critical point because ultimately, I think what's going to define Africa's tech rush is whether or not it is controlled by the people of Africa or it's simply happening to the people of Africa. And so, ultimately, I think what's going to yield the most synergies is if we're taking advantage of all the resources and the untapped opportunities of the continent, which includes the individuals on the ground as well, and the way that they're thinking about building businesses there and building businesses that not only address the needs of the continent, but of the global diaspora, and I think, honestly, humanity in general.
Yeah.
What kind of disruption do you think tech could bring to a place like Africa?
Lots of good kinds.
And lots of bad kinds,
yeah,
too.
Completely.
Well,
Elaborate.
some people get very worried about the challenges related to artificial intelligence, for instance, or automation. And I'd love your thoughts on this. I feel as if Africa is in a better place in a bunch of ways because a lot of the jobs that I think will be most challenged are not as structured or connected yet. When you think about the kind of jobs that exist above the API line, the kind of jobs that, as long as there are jobs for humans, will continue to exist. High-end service industry, but really craft-like things that require creativity. Software development is only one of many examples. I think that you've got a huge amount of room for growth across the continent.
I think that, so one, Africa's made of 54 countries, 54 today, honestly, anything can happen, there could be 55 tomorrow. But 54 today, and each country is very different, right? So, and each market will accept technology in a different way. But if I were to attempt to speak broadly about the continent, the key thing that I think is very exciting is the way that it tends to leapfrog. It kind of thrives in pushing technologies that allow you to leapfrog over anything that's very entrenched or requires a lot of upfront capital. Because what happens when you can't get financing because of political risk and currency risk is that you have to figure out how to do things in a more modular and scalable way. You'll see that a lot of technologies in Silicon Valley are attempting to do that now too, but there's such stability in the entrenched old way of doing things. The grid works great here. The landlines work great, even though they're not as convenient. I can name several. The government, government. Okay, used to be stable. Don't want to start anything. And so it's when you're designing these things that are meant to kind of go direct to consumer, direct to the individual, and skip over the bureaucracy, there's less of an incentive. But on the continent, I remember in 2010, my cousins having a much better cell phone than I did. And I'm being like, wait a minute, this is like AWU, not the village. And you're over here laughing at my LG flip phone, which I thought was fly, and apparently wasn't.
And they were already sending money
and
back
they
and
were
forth
already,
with it.
exactly.
You were like, wait, what? You can do
so I think that when you look at what's happening in telecom and the ability to communicate, what's happening in the financial services, again, and able to send money without having the huge infrastructure of banks, what's happening even in the film world in terms of skipping over the theaters and just distributing films directly, when you see that moving like rapid fire, you say, wow, technology coming to places like the African continent can really spread innovation and connect people in a much deeper way. However, I think that what's also going to be critical is seeing how we can just generally increase exposure to what it means to be African, not just from the grand concept of the continent, but from an individual perspective, the countries and the people within these countries as well, because everyone's so different that my only fear with technology is that if it's too broadly deployed, you'll have this kind of convergence and we'll lose cultures and we'll lose the things that I think make the continent so beautiful.
We're going to go to an audience poll. And the question is, can Africa compete with Silicon Valley, China, and India as a tech innovation hub? Number 1, yes. Number 2, no. Let's vote. Wow.
Okay, all right. No, let me just take my earrings off and get this started. All right, I'm just going to turn this way. Okay.
So, Jessica, you have to make a better case for this.
No. Okay, so the question, no, people are changing their answers. Am I scaring you?
Exactly.
So
They're getting nervous.
I know.
They're getting very nervous. Can we get one person who is willing to say why they think no? Is someone brave enough to express that?
No. Okay, will Africa join Silicon? It's not even, so the question is, will it join Silicon Valley, China, India as a tech innovation hub? That's very interesting, and a majority of people said no. This is what I meant, I think, the flip side of exposure. I think, so I will say that kinetic energy technologies and a lot of new renewable energy technologies will struggle to catch hold in the US and Europe because the grid simply works too well and energy is simply too inexpensive. If you compare paying 10 cents per kilowatt hour here in the US to maybe paying $1 in Somalia, you'll see why there's an opportunity to go to the African continent. However, when people hear Somalia, they think about that movie with, what's his name, Tom Hanks. They start thinking about pirates, and they're like, oh, no, I don't want to go there. Trust, not everyone in Somalia is like, a pirate. But I believe it or not, I know very intelligent, intellectual people who will, drop down, in Nigeria or in Botswana and be waiting to see a giraffe run across the road. And that's because they don't have any concept of what's happening on the ground and the dynamics of it. And there's a lot that's happening in media to change that. Anthony Bourdain just went to Lagos, actually visited Andela's office, and showcased, it is an amazing episode, and showcased this. There are different shows now that are showcasing the reality of what's happening there. And on one hand, I love that people write things like this, right? Because I'm benefiting from asymmetrical information. If more people know how amazing Africa is, I'm not going to make as much money. That's just the reality of the situation.
That's true.
And so it's like, so on one hand, I love that, but it is, the kind of humanist side of me, the side that's like, wow, I can't believe it's so scary, wants more people to actually take the trip there and, connect with some amazing organizations to actually see the tech ecosystem.
Jeremy, you actually got a real confidence boost when Mark Zuckerberg visited Africa, right?
I was just about to ask.
Running on the Ikoyi Bridge like it was nothing.
So you're backed by the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, and you just raised a new round of funding, right?
Indeed, a couple days ago. Yeah. I told you I'd have something I wanted to talk about.
So tell us your news.
Yeah. So as of we announced Tuesday, it was sorry, the New York Times, not the Wall Street Journal, but it was the cover
Breaking
of the business
it
section.
on stage at the Wall Street Journal.
Exactly. I'm here physically, though. And it was, the announcement was that we just closed our Series C, and it's another 40, which is total of what we'd raised before.
81 million.
Yeah, but also the largest investment by an African venture fund, led by an African venture fund, into an Africa-focused company thus far to date, which says, something about what's happened with Andela and what we've built over the past few years, but it says also a lot about what's happening with the broader African tech ecosystem and how it continues to evolve. When Mark invested, a little over a year ago, this is going to sound crazy, but he came to visit a couple months later. That was his first trip to the continent. That was also the first trip.
Just exposing his secret stuff.
No, well, he talked about it. He was excited about the chance to actually spend some time in a new part of the world. And his feedback, sitting down with a handful of Andela developers, it's my favorite. There's a young woman named Blessing that he sat down with. She explained that she had applied to Andela, this program that has a sub 1% acceptance rate, didn't get in. It was like, all right, I'll apply again. Apply the second time. Doesn't get in again. This time, it's like, you know what? They made a mistake. Just shows up to work. Literally, just shows up and like, yeah, you guys made a mistake.
Blessing's Nigerian.
She's so Nigerian and so awesome.
Yeah.
And at that
group.
point, it's like, well, this is kind of exactly what we're looking for. So sure, let's give it a shot. She's crushing it. Like, fast forward a year, absolutely crushing it. And his response to that, he talked about it in the next couple of days, was like, if that is your attitude, you win. And going to that poll, that is why I'm not at all concerned about what the actual outcome is going to be and whether Africa will turn into a significant tech ecosystem. And it won't be Africa as an ecosystem. It will be lots of tech ecosystems across the continent without question. But whether or not the potential exists across each of those ecosystems is so not even a question for me that it's fun to be able to talk about. I'd love if folks here who haven't been could find some time. Let us know. We'll give you directions.
I mean,
we're going to go to
check it out at some point. It's worth
in a bit.
It's worth it.
But just before we go to audience questions, let's talk about risks, though, and challenges of operating in Africa. Not everything's rosy.
No,
right?
it's true. I mean, and I think the key things that we often look at as a business are political risk and currency risk, right? So, and that really comes down to the way you're even structuring your agreements and your contracts. So if you're expecting that there might be some instability in the political regime, how long should the contract be? 2 years, 3 years, whatnot? Are you comfortable with a payback period of 5 to 10 years, or would you like something that's closer to 2 to 3? And what does that mean in terms of what type of products you can bring there? Currency risk is huge. Making sure you're paid in dollars, making sure that they are solvent in dollars, understanding things like sovereign immunity, especially if you work with governments. These are all things that are part of the process. However, we find that often there's a way to structure the deal that you can get through that. And further, I think it helps to do business with people who have been successfully growing their businesses on the ground. And that's why it's actually very helpful to have African investors. Thinking also, again, why this is really a bridge, not just people going there, but back and forth. You just recently raised a round that was led by an African venture firm. When we raised our Series A in 2016,
with $7 million.
Yeah, it was the largest Series A that any Black woman had raised in history globally. Not just in Africa. However, 50% of our funds came from African investors. Awesome. And technically, we are a New York-based business. And so there's an opportunity to connect with investors globally and connect with people who are generating real revenues. The richest Black man in the world is this Nigerian dude that makes cement, sugar, and flour. Like, his name is Dangote. And so these are opportunities, and these are people that we're not always reaching if we stay in a bubble. And I think that now, beyond just as investors, these are also operations partners that can help us navigate the political risk issues and the currency risk issues, and be the partners that you need to scale in areas where there's some uncertainty. And so that's what's been really great. We've really have leaned on our investor team to tell us what does it mean to work in a space where there's concessions? What does it mean to think about distribution and supply chain in these markets? Because they've been able to run successful businesses, regardless of whether you want to call it a startup or not. They are running successful businesses and have a lot to share.
I think we have a question over there. Can we get a mic?
Hi, my name is Aviv. You asked who's brave to say he voted no. So I'm brave enough, but I voted yes. And the thing is like this. We have a clicker with many numbers, and you ask yes or no. I think it is lie in the question. If you ask how many years it will take for Africa to be a player, then people would say 10 years, 20 years, or 2 years. And then you have a goal to achieve, to push it or pull it
Bring it forward.
Earlier, right? Because I think yes and no questions is very tough. I mean, we can see it from politics, right?
Indeed.
Any other questions? Okay, Jessica, I wanted to ask you, though, do you have any plans to expand your product portfolio to other markets?
For us, it's interesting. We see ourselves as a global company, and we see a huge opportunity in emerging markets in general, but we believe that a focus on Africa is key. We do meet people often who say, your technology is so cool, everyone needs it. And it's true, but again, we're talking about the markets where we have significant relationships that we've been developing over the last decade, where we know that there's a real need from a financial perspective, from a sustainability perspective. And also I think, unfortunately, because of the way the map has been drawn, people just don't know how big Africa is. It is huge. And simply really scaling and establishing our technology, which is called MORE technology. It's an acronym. It stands for Motion-Based Off-Grid Renewable Energy. Establishing that core technology across the continent would be huge. It'd be huge in a way where kind of there would be network effects that would allow us to expand to emerging Asia and Latin America relatively easy. But overall, we are looking at emerging markets like Africa, Latin America, emerging Asia, as well as disaster-prone areas like the Caribbean and some areas of the United States as well, because we believe in the future of decentralized microgrids. And we see our technology as a way to modularly and scale, with some bit of kind of tempered scalability, be able to connect individuals and give them power, whether they're in a village or an enterprise solution. Really look at how we can change the way people are thinking about consuming and generating energy. And so that we're very excited about. But we believe that the future of that is going to be in emerging markets.
Jeremy, your expansion plans?
Yeah, we are planning on expanding aggressively, but it's all within the continent. The way that we think about it is Africa is probably the most underappreciated. Like human capital in general, one of the most under-leveraged and utilized resources on the planet. You look across Africa, there's, in part, as you can see from sort of the common media perception of the continent, the world just doesn't realize yet the amount of talent and brain power and ability that exists. And I think as we move towards a world, let's call it 10 years from now, on a pretty reasonable horizon where you've got virtual reality good enough for it to feel as if we're having this conversation live, but we're not actually all in the same room, then it becomes sort of obvious that, of course, you would have distributed teams. At which point it becomes obvious that, of course, you just want the best person possible for your team. At which point it becomes obvious that, well, if there's a large amount of brain power of extraordinary people, then you'd want to be able to tap into that. And I think that means that we've got a lot of work to do.
I think also sometimes it even helps just to think about the economics of it. Like, let's take one country, Nigeria, on the continent, has nearly 200 million people. If you develop a product or service that charges them $1 a year, you're making $200 million a year. I mean, I don't know what you're selling, I don't know what you've made, but I think it behooves you to figure something out and get there. And that for us is the reason why we're so excited to be on the ground. There's just so many people with so many needs that have been ignored for too long.
This time next year at DLAG Laguna, if you could predict, could we see a $1 billion startup from Africa emerging?
So we've seen it. There have been a couple unicorns. I don't know if they call themselves unicorns, but I think that this past year was the first.
Wasn't Jumia like the
Jumia
Amazon?
and InterSwitch, yeah. Sort of Amazon of
the Amazon of
the
Africa.
continent, yeah. It's mostly Nigeria focused thus far. I think it's where we're seeing the most activity around the tech ecosystems, in part because of Nigerian drive and hustle, but also in part because you're talking about nearly 200 million people. It's just it's the 13th largest country in the world right now, but over the next 40 years, moving towards the
It'll
third.
It'll be the third,
It's very real. And so, I do think we will see very large companies coming out of the continent, and we will see companies coming out of the continent that are engaging with other tech companies around the world as equal partners and players in the ecosystem, which is going to be, I think, a pretty great thing for the world.
I think what's going to be critical is going to be less about what actually happens on the continent and the perception of the continent. There are companies there are people there that are building amazing things, there are people that are going to top universities, then going back to the continent to work and live, kind of, working towards the reverse brain drain. And it'll just be a question of whether or not Silicon Valley wants to recognize it. And I'm almost certain that Africans won't care, because they'll be making, so I think it's really, it's like, it's going to be a question of whether or not people outside of the continent want to be a part of what's happening, but it's already happening. I actually think 10 years is a bit too long to start seeing some really exciting things happening in Nigeria and Kenya especially. But But there are a few other countries. Rwanda is another one that I think people should watch for the next 3 years very closely.
Thanks very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Thank you.